And especially in a city like Calcutta, where this genre of statuary stands caught in a particular historical bind of the blending of India's colonial and post-colonial histories. The giant public statues of rulers and notables of the empire were among the most monumental and widely traveling objects of British India. And that was the starting point in that commodity and circulation, that something like this, which is one of the finest pieces, Henry Foley's Outram, we will see how the kinds of histories of travel associated with these. Okay, so they are sometimes the most widely traveling objects of British India, with Calcutta and London operating as the two central depots of orders and supplies. Through the 19th and early 20th century, these statues, commissioned from India and largely financed by public subscription, they were not set up by the government, raised by committees set up in India, were made in stone sculpting studios and bronze casting foundries in England, and then laboriously transported to India for installation at designated memorial sites, with often several years elapsing between the time of their commissioning and their final arrival and erection in different cities of the empire. So, for instance, with John Henry Foley's famous equestrian statue of General Outram, of course, from the 1857 mutiny, we know of the history of General Outram, now standing in the Victoria Memorial Grounds. When following the commission given to Foley in 1861 by a combined London and Calcutta committee, the government of India had to send across to London 11 tons of gunmetal for the casting of the figure, the finished form of which was transported to Calcutta 13 years later and ceremonially unveiled in 1874 at the crossing of Park Street and Red Road. As cultural commodities, these statues then contain within them elaborate and prolonged material histories of production, transactions, and travels, linking the metropolitan and colonial topographies of the memorialization of imperial power. Within the colony, these monumental objects can be seen to continue to change locations and occupy new sites of display and attention. This was especially the case when Calcutta's grand monument, where we stand today, the Victoria Memorial, was completed in 1921, and several statues that today seem to be an integral part of the building and its grounds were actually transferred here from other locations. And this was, of course, be well known to many people here. So one of these, for instance, is the statue of Lord Cornwallis, under which many of us have attended many talks. Okay, so this is early marble sculpture of Lord Cornwallis, finds him masquerading as a fake Roman emperor. I often wondered about how was Cornwallis posing quite like this, till the telltale marks of the fakeness is seen to be written in the very body of this impersonation, where if you look around Cornwallis's neck, what you see like a necklace is actually his head. So it's only Cornwallis's head, and you imported these neoclassical statuary of Roman emperors and Greek statuary, which were freely available. So you literally got them, and you could take anybody's head and paste them on it. So it's a literal cut and paste job, which is, quite clear about what empire was all about. So the telltale mark of its fakeness is written in the very body of the sculpture, and it was pointed out to me by a scholar, Alfred Drury, who's done many of the sculpting around the Victoria Memorial. His grandson, Julian Drury, took me on a round of my own city and told me more about the sculptures than I ever knew. So again, that's quite interesting, that why we need to return our attention to some of these. There are also statues like those of Lord Bentinck or Outram, which were transferred from their prior locations within and around the town hall or at the Park Street, Chorangi junctions. In fact, when I was looking at the exhibitions of Bone and Shepherd and Johnston and Hoffman, one of the great fascinating bits of it was to be able to spot where the statues stood in their original location. So I will get back to some of that material. Hardinge is very clear, but many others, one has a better sense of where they actually stood. 2 decades after the end of empire, The politically turbulent decade of the late 1960s in Calcutta brought with it another dramatic spate of dislodging, replacements, and relocations across different spaces of the city and its outskirts. And this is a theme that I hope to take up in a longer paper. That it's interesting that for 20 years after independence, Calcutta's colonial statues actually still remained on the streets of Calcutta. It was in the sudden short sweep between 1967 and 69, during the regime of the first United Front government in West Bengal under Jatin Chakraborty, that all the statues of colonial rulers were programmatically removed of the city streets by the Public Works Department and transported to the grounds of the Flagstaff House in the nearby cantonment town of Barakpur, leaving untouched the large group that stood inside the Victoria Memorial grounds. And those of you who've seen Paresh Pathor will know that they're still in place. When he's going on his wonderful tour around the Maidan, all the colonial statues are still there. And Vinay Shen's Calcutta 71 actually begins with the removal of a statue. Again, just reminding. So the moment is very interesting. It's late 60s, 70s that this is happening. Okay, now Calcutta's colonial statues were never destroyed or vandalized, as, for instance, happened with the colonial statuary in Bombay in the 1950s and the violence attending the state formation of Maharashtra. Calcutta statues, on the other hand, may have fallen into neglect. They remained in location, and then when they finally moved to Barakpur, they lay strewn here till they were carefully rehoused around the neoclassical war cenotaph. Largely happened under, I think, Shah and later Gopal Gandhi. I think they took a lot of interest in redesigning the complex. And then they were set up on brick pedestals on the lawns of Flagstaff House, the equestrian and standing statues neatly laid out in coordinated groups on two sides of the grounds at Barakpur. Over the 1970s, once these statues were removed, in the midst of the city, in a strange musical chairs game of substitutions, a series of Indian nationalist leaders began to take their stands in the spots emptied of the colonial masters. So this is United Front leading into early years of the Left Front. Over the 1970s, so in 1970, one of the earliest, Deshobandhu Chittaranjan Das came up in the island where an equestrian Lord Canning had stood for 90 years before, and we saw Lord Canning in the photographs which are there, before he was banished to the riverbanks at Barakpur to keep company with the ornate tombstone of his wife. Lady Canning was buried in Barakpur. In 1972, a sculpture of the young martyr Khudiram Bose replaced Lord Auckland on the same plinth at the junction of the State Assembly House, with the Auckland statue traveling all the way to the city named after him in New Zealand. So think of how far statues go. Hardinge also returned to England. Hardinge was taken back. In 1976, the figure of another Bengali revolutionary, Master Da Shujjo Sen, took Lord Northbrook's place against the Gothic majesty of the Calcutta High Court, and on the pedestal you have the names of all the people of the Chittagong Armory raid written there. Perhaps the only memorial we have to the Ostrogal Lunton here. This is when the nationalist statue mania that took off from the 1940s, from its 19th century colonial precedent, reached its post-colonial peak. This is also when this quintessentially colonial genre of figurative sculpture found itself continuously contending with its domesticated career as a local representational and commemorative practice. Come to the second section, which is called, where I look at the question of materiality and objecthood more closely. In this section, I'll be looking more closely on the idea of the dead object. On the sense of the inert and inanimate, we know that statues have no life, they're inert and inanimate, that seem to be embedded in the very nature of these massive figural statuary that render them monumental on the very terms that empties them of all semblance of life and movement. Let us think of how the Oxford English Dictionary defines statue as 1, a representation in the round of a living being sculpted, molded, or cast in metal, plaster, or the like material. And 2, a type of silence or absence of movement or feeling. We all know as children we used to play statues, no? It was about freezing suddenly. One of the central paradoxes, I would argue, lies in the way these constitutive elements of freezing and stillness, the absence of movement and feeling, results in the draining of life and affect from these figures, which are made to embody presence and personhood, whereby public statues become literally and metaphorically as dead as the humans they represent and substitute. These public statues, even the ones sculpted with the greatest finesse and similitude, exist more as imposing objects rather than as affective images, functioning more as markers of places than of persons. Let us consider the logic of form and materiality in this genre of imagery and the purpose these serve in transforming human likeness into monumental objects and symbols of power. Let's think on one hand of the material that goes into the production and form of these statues, and the factor of the place it is made to occupy, on the other hand. Together they make for a particular trajectory of presence and personhood in this genre of marble, bronze, or plaster statuary. And the point which I'll emphasize in this section is that this holds them apart from the other kinds of animation and human likeness that exudes within other realist visual genres, like, say, the portrait photograph or the wax model. It is instructive to construct a statuary with these 2 other mimetic representational forms, ones most readily associated with exact simulations of living persons, to see how the transference of presence from person to image operates very differently in each of these. To use W.J.T. Mitchell, theorist of visual culture's formulation, there are different kinds of desires and loves that animate these other forms of human likeness, different demands they make on the viewer, and different modes by which the image authenticates itself vis-à-vis the original referent. Much has been written on how the photograph becomes most efficacious as the trace of the real, as the staging of an absent presence, as the preservation of personhood beyond death. And we all know how we treasure photographs as the trace of the person who's no more. The photograph of the dead person assumes its special charge in a sculpting studio, such as this, when it is often from a small and sole photographic image that the statue maker is made to recreate an imagined likeness, persuasive likeness, giving special attention to matters of hairstyle, accessories, and attire, also placing it within the format of the bust or full figure. It also struck me how ordinary people also become statues, right? So very often when you go to Kumattuli, apart from your standard rounds of Netaji, Vivekananda, and others, we find actually ordinary people whose work are being commissioned as statues. So it's a form of commemoration, and this is a very poignant one of this, a Kargil war person. We see another case here. Okay, so the nature, so here again we have a small photograph, and Shunil Pal is actually making a full-seated statuary out of it. So the nature of the sculpting material, and all he has as likeness is one photograph. But you have family members who will say, yes, the posture is right or not right, etc. The nature of the sculpting material, whether it be layers of clay and plaster, molten and hardened bronze, or carved and chiseled marble, intervenes centrally in this process of mimesis, where the tactile feel of human flesh and drapes of clothing get translated into the mass languages of metal and stone. Simultaneously, the pose of the painted or photographed figure must be transferred into a set of formal sculptural conventions, often of pompous and gesticulating postures, like Sharad Push pointing up his hand, or stances of deep and frozen contemplation. Ordinary clothing must give way to official ceremonial costumes, and yes, thrones and horses must come in whenever they are people of importance, especially military men like Outram. Critical here are the effects, especially of voluminous masses of drapery, in transforming the human anatomy into an abstracted monumental object. Nothing as exemplifies this better than the enormous spreading robes of the seated Queen Victoria that dramatically makes up her regal bulk at the entrance to the Victoria Memorial. Okay, but we also see in others, like this image by Ramesh Pal, of the attention paid to drapery, flows of dhotis, saris, we saw in the Matungini Hajras one. So the importance on drapery and folds is important. From the beginning of its history into recent times, this genre of public statuary has followed two conventional methods of sculpture making, either carving, modeling, and chiseling from the outside, as with figures made of blocks of marble, granite, or sandstone, or casting from the inside out, as with models made of clay, plaster, wax, or fiber, where a negative inner mold may be deployed to cast a positive replica in molten metal like bronze. The latter technique contains the possibility of an actual human head and body serving as the core from which a clay and plaster mold may be taken and layered upon. This is the idea of the death mask, if you remember. The death mask was actually a mold taken straight off the face, and that was one commemorative form. Right, now, this was the basis, as I said. So while this has been an experimental practice with the creed of contemporary sculptors, many of them use their own and others' bodies as what they call corpographs, caked in plaster to make molds out of. This was also the basis of an earlier practice, as I said, of making death masks from the faces of corpses, and served as the core technique out of which Madame Tussauds perfected her art of making exact wax models of the dead and living. In a wax modeling career that began in France in late 18th century at the height of the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, Madame Tussauds' models were first taken of casts taken directly from dead bodies and guillotined heads. So there's a very bloody history to the beginning of the wax model, wonderful book on this. Before she graduated to other modes of replicating exact likenesses of her subjects. This is where, when you actually think that an actual head forms the mold, this is where wax models took on the aura of holy effigies and reliquaries of medieval saints, carrying in them the bodily trace of the original persons. This is also where modern sculpture wishes, as W.J.T. Mitchell writes, not just for a place to be, but to be a place itself, a place where someone has lived. Can the kinds of marble or bronze statuary we are concerned with ever play out a similar desire to function as a trace or place of the once living, which is that actually encompassing that? Can we really think of the hard, impassive, impenetrable exteriors as hiding a soft, animate core within? There's a striking contrast to be drawn here with the forms of animation in life-size wax models, the closest popular equivalent of this form of figural sculpture, one which has followed a similar techniques as bronze or plaster statuary, or being cast from inside out. Even as it has moved far from its early modes of cast making from real heads and bodies, wax models we know have continued to work with actual organic substances like hair, eyelashes, articles of clothing. So we know that Michael Jackson's jeans is actually there, Princess Diana's actual clothes are taken on, and so on. Okay? So, and wax and silicone as substance, with its natural glistening surface and ability to hold light within itself, has been ideally suited to recreating the softness and luminosity of flesh. All in all, wax models epitomize the simulacrum's quest for authenticity. Flesh-colored and fully clothed, they invite beholders to override their actual fakery and engage with them in their mysterious fullness of life. In a museum that remains one of the biggest popular attractions of Britain and now has branches in cities across the world. So Madame Tussauds we know is everywhere. In Bengal, our chief minister set up her own wax model museum. She didn't want Madame Tussauds, so it's called the Mother's Wax Museum. And I won't get into that here. These wax or silicon models serve their main purpose in allowing crowds to mingle and mix with them in close quarters. This is very important, that there's an eye-to-eye contact, and play their best tricks, as we know, in letting originals pose with their doubles, challenging us to separate the real from the copy. So every time a wax model is made, we know that the person goes and poses, and you're asked to say who's the real one. They carry with them the full charge of the Pygmalion syndrome, that sensual desire of dead matter turning into living form, the quality of the uncanny, wherein the inert sculpted likeness seems likely at any point of erupting to life. It is precisely this kind of mimetic figures that could have met Robert Musil's demand that they turn, tap their feet, or at least blink their eyes. But never the stilled and somber marble and bronze public figures which stand high on their pedestals, aloof, beyond the intrusive touch or eye-level gaze of viewers. It could be argued that these statues hold their own by stubbornly refusing to succumb to the popular demands for animation and exact simulations of a living being. They stick with unapologetic conviction to the inanimate materiality of their stone and metal bodies and the stylized conventions of their distant looks and frozen postures. So I actually make the argument that they don't want to be like wax models. In fact, they look down, they see itself as a fine art form, and they look askance at the form of mannequins and wax models as a lesser mimetic form. Now, even as this Western genre has over the years found its way into the practices of a variety of big and small local sculpture making studios, there's been an unending investment in keeping going some of the material and formal conventions of this style of realist statuary. So, for instance, we find that there's an avoidance of lifelike coloring, marks out the particularities of this commemorative form, and finds its articulation even among the workmen of the small sculpture studios that operate within the vicinities of the city's main idol-making hub at Kumutuli, where from the mid-20th century there were many from traditional clay modeling families who acquired art school training and diversified into the parallel practice and livelihood of commissioned statue making. The adding on of colors and clothes, in their view, is associated with the sculpting of pratima, a form they feel need to be strictly kept apart from realist figural sculptures, and color is seen to be the property of the devotional or worshipped icon. By contrast, pristine white is seen to bring gravity, dignity, and its own quality of sacrality to the sculpted figures of great men and women, and is regarded as the most appropriate color for civic statuary. Now, what's interesting is that now you have more and more plaster statues made. Marble is hardly used, but people paint them in bronze colors, and we know that with every rain, the colors then trickle off. So I've also wondered that the only colored statue in Salt Lake is Mother Teresa, so maybe she's acquired the divine stature. Everybody else has remained non-colored. So colored, but made to look like bronze or marble. Okay. So whether made in the cheap medium of plaster or the new durable lightweight medium of fiberglass, these sculptures are given a white coloring and the look of marble, as we see in this group of busts and figures in one such Kumattuli studio of Ashim Chandrapal, of an all-white Ramakrishna, Sharada Devi, Rani Rashmani, alongside a Derozio, and a family patriarch whom his descendants wish to immortalize as a statue. I remember first asking, is this Jyoti Basu? And they were horrified. They said, no. Then, suddenly I saw this man sitting there. Or we have this lineup of an